Welcome to Coffee Break with Police Experts. I'm David Griffith, editor of Police Magazine. Our guest for this video is Dr. Heidi Sievers. Dr. Sievers is an instructor in the forensic degree program at Columbia Southern University, and she is a certified crime scene analyst and certified bloodstain pattern analyst, one of 65 worldwide. Our discussion is going to focus on how officers and forensic teams can work together to achieve the best results. Dr. Sievers, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me a little bit about you and your position with CSU.
Sure. So I am one of the full-time faculty members in the forensics department, now that we've moved over to forensics being an entire bachelor's degree program. So I instruct with them, as well as still staying active in the field through training, law enforcement, and private consultation as it relates to forensics and bloodstain pattern analysis.
What are the key things CSU students learn in the forensics degree program?
Absolutely. So we really strive to provide our students with not only the fundamental knowledge, or what I call the textbook knowledge of background, history, procedures of certain forensic processes, but we also give them an in-depth look of those hands-on activities. So whether that be an activity that they can do at home or outlining what that would be like. We do a lot of case studies, a lot of practicals where they'll actually engage in forensic photography, whether it be making their own crime scene at home, getting creative, and then working methodically through that themselves. Or it may be something like an actual case study and then their approach to how they would investigate it, as well as working with other entities such as law enforcement, fire investigators, medical examiners.
You don't want to take too far that making your own crime scene at home.
Oh, they love it.
There are personnel shortages in all areas of law enforcement. Is this true for forensic professionals as well?
So the trends that I've seen really just depend on the areas. I've seen significant shortages in larger metropolitan style areas, whereas in the more rural counties, there seems to be an overflow of applicants. I know kind of around where I am, more rural area of Florida, from what I've heard from my colleagues is anytime there's an opening, they're getting around 200 applicants.
Wow.
But on the contrary side of that, in some of the areas where the call volumes are just astronomically high and they really just can't keep up because burnout is very real in this field. Typically in those type of areas, an individual might be working, 25 homicides a year, 50 calls a month, which is it's a lot, especially if you're working alone. So the trends I've seen is in those style of areas, there are shortages, whereas in the more rural communities, there seem to be a lot of people fighting at the door to get in.
Well, as you know, a lot of officers are leaving law enforcement for a variety of reasons, retiring early or just plain quitting. Do you see sworn officers wanting to study forensics and become crime scene analysts?
I do actually, in a lot of trainings that I've done all over the United States, as well as internationally, I do get a lot of law enforcement that are looking to transition or are going back to school to get an associate's or a bachelor's in crime scene technology or forensics to transition over to a civilian role. For a lot of agencies, that's still the higher risk retirement. So they're still kind of able to stay with that status. They may have to do, a couple more years depending on the agency and depending on the retirement system. But a lot of them just kind of want the heat off of their back a little bit to do something, although still stressful, still, high prevalence for trauma, vicarious trauma, but not so dangerous. So I have seen that quite a bit. Every once in a while, we'll see the opposite, forensic investigators who actually want to go out on the road and become deputies. But I would say deputies wanting to take on a civilian role, especially in these times, is I've seen a high prevalence of that.
When I first started working as editor of police 20 years ago, I actually had on my advisory board a homicide detective who was a crime scene investigator. Are there many sworn crime scene investigators still out there, or has it just become a civilian job?
So there's not many. I do work with agencies who their crime scene unit or forensic unit are all sworn, but not common, especially down here in Florida and southern states. It's typically a completely civilian position. But in the agencies that they are sworn, typically they're taking on more of a detective role. They just also happen to process their own scenes. So it's very rare that I'll get an agency that is solely crime scene. They're not doing any other duties such as detective work or first responder style duties and crime scene. Typically, like that's pretty rare that they are sworn and only do crime scene.
So if you want to stay on the job and you want to study forensics just for the enlightenment of it or to help you in your job task, what are some of the things that you need to learn?
So, first and foremost, some of those things would be photography. That is one of the most underrated and underemphasized tools that we, as forensic professionals, experts, practitioners, utilize day in and day out, really understanding how to use a camera. It sounds very basic, but if you don't know how to use a camera, this job is very difficult because it's not always point and shoot or click. I know a lot of times deputies on the road, they can use cell phones now. They can use a little point and shoot cameras that are still, in circulation. But for forensics, we're using, DSLRs, whether mirrored or mirrorless, and we can't always just put it on program or auto and point and shoot. We have to be able to photograph in manual mode. So photography is a huge aspect of it. I'm a big proponent on learning in-depth death investigation as it relates to cause, manner, mechanism of death, and investigation tactics for that, as well as fingerprinting methods. So a large part of what forensic investigators do, whether you're working property crimes, major crimes, or both, is fingerprint processing beyond just the simple black powder and brush.
Yeah, there's a lot to do at a crime scene, right? I mean, it just seems like it's overwhelming.
It can be very inundating, certainly depending on the cards you're dealt.
What are your top 3 tips for on-scene officers can do before and after their arrival to a crime scene to support the forensic investigation?
Sure. So, forensic investigators, we understand that when officers arrive on scene, it's a very dynamic, moving, fluid situation that they're in. You can't always arrive and everything stay in the exact same place. We know that officers have to deal with suspects and victims and witnesses and the nosy neighbor. But even if things change within the scene, best thing an officer could do is document that, even just a quick note. If a location of an item changes, if someone leaves, if there was a person there prior to forensics arrival, anything that changes, to notate that down and communicate that to the forensic investigator. That's always my first tip. Second, kind of segueing from that, is to utilize personal protective measures. So easiest way is just to put gloves on. And I know sometimes things are moving fast, adrenaline's pumping, we don't always remember, but going back to note taking, if you forget to put gloves on and you touch something, just make a note to let the forensic investigator know. But applying gloves can really preserve the integrity of that scene and eliminate you from popping up on an APHIS hit. And number 3 is to try the best you can to include forensics on your either briefings before processing starts or debriefings after. A lot of times, information that deputies have, they may not think is important to forensics, but it can really dictate the way we process a scene or move forward with a scene or even process an item of evidence, depending on what happened with that item of evidence prior to our arrival. And on the opposite side of that, forensics, from what they process and what they find, that may help law enforcement with their investigative approach, whether it be talking to certain people, asking very specific questions to kind of corroborate or clear up some things that maybe a witness, a victim, or a suspect may have told them prior to. So first and foremost, make notes if anything changes in the scene prior to their arrival. Put on and change gloves as frequently and as much as you can, barring exigent circumstances, and just continuously communicate through the scene in the form of briefings and debriefings with the forensics team.
You're talking about PPE. That's one of the things that drives me crazy in movies and television. Is the detective is walking all around the scene with like 5 or 6 people, and the CSIs are there. They've got like booties and gloves and jumpsuits on, and you're like, what is going on here?
Yeah, right. I know it's either dramatized on both ends of the spectrum. It's either in TV, they're wearing nothing, or they're wearing a full hazmat suit. There is no
Yeah,
in
yeah.
between.
But yeah, I always get excited when I see somebody break out booties because I'm like, well,
Yeah.
somebody took some notes.
Yes, exactly. And there's a lot of agencies who actually collect booties. And it sounds crazy, but sometimes it's just that last ditch effort for any type of material that may, be left behind. So and you don't want to be the one that leaves behind your boot print, whether it's in blood or not. A lot of times we'll break out a large magnetic powder brush and go at the floor. And next thing you know, we have your shoe print everywhere. So you never want to be that person.
It used to be they would warn officers about drinking, smoking, eating at scenes. Do you still see that?
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest things is the chewing of gum. We get a lot that chew gum, or the chewing tobacco isn't as common anymore. You still see it sometimes, but I would say drinking in the scene, water, soda, things like that, or chewing gum is very common. And not only can it affect the integrity of our crime scene, but you never know what's going on in the air in there. And as you're chomping on that gum, you're inhaling who knows what. And I always say, especially when there's flies in the scene, if the flies are landing on you, think of what they landed on before. And if you're opening your mouth to drink, eat, chew gum, and a fly lands in your mouth, you don't want to think about where that fly was before. So,
Okay, what's the one thing you see officers do at scenes that you most want them to change?
accessing the scene and going about the scene without gloves, because more times than not, I would get APHIS hits back to deputies or detectives, and a lot of times, maybe it's just they don't realize, going in and out of a door. But if a suspect accessed the same door, that's going to be a very prime area, or, the areas of high probability, as I call them, to process. So I would say just stay cognizant of areas that you would theorize forensics would want to take a look at. If there's an area with a bunch of missing items, if it's a burglary, for example, maybe stay clear of that area until forensics gets there, or at minimum, put some gloves on. Because what we see a lot is, especially in burglaries and things like that, like, oh, here's an area where there's items missing, and they want to go in there even with a victim and say, okay, what's all missing? And they're opening cabinets. But if there's things missing from that area, we know the suspect has most likely been there touching it, possibly without gloves. And that's going to be our highest area of probability for evidence. So I would say, on top of just putting gloves and PPE on, is taking a step back when you can and waiting for forensics to arrive and developing game plans together. A lot of times we get on scene and deputies or detectives have, already completely searched the scene. Things are pulled out of cabinets, out of closets. They've opened every door. Obviously scenes need to be cleared for safety, but on top of that, the extreme searches, I would say to hold off on until forensics can collaborate with you.
You've just written an article for police on communications between forensic teams and officers. What's one thing that could be improved in that world in that communications bridge?
Yeah, I would say, and this can relate to after the scene as well, when, detective units have their debriefings or powwows, but on scene, just taking the time to, during your walkthrough, have a discussion, kind of halfway through or midpoint through processing, as well as when you're about to clear the scene, have conversations throughout that between everyone on scene. So if you have first responders on scene that arrived, if you have detectives and you have crime scene personnel, get together and communicate on your plan of action before the processing begins. Hey, after my walkthrough, this is what I'm going to do. This is where I'm going to focus on. Everything that you're planning to do. About halfway through, or as things come up, have another, powwow, briefing, whatever people want to call it, and say, this is what I've found so far. This is what else I need to do. And this is the information I've gathered. And then detectives and deputies can do the same thing to forensics, because that may change what I need to do. It may add on something I need to do. And then, of course, at the end, before you leave, doing the same type of communication sharing. Because a lot of times it happens where, maybe the next day, the next week, people say, hey, did you collect this or did you process this area? And forensics had no idea that that area existed, or that the dumpster down the road was actually involved in the situation because that piece of information was never shared, and vice versa. Detectives may have no idea that maybe they need to talk to somebody because of something forensics found. So I would say communication should be fluid throughout the entire scene and throughout the entire investigation. It doesn't have to be so formal as before, middle, and after, but taking that initiative on both sides to kind of check in with one another.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sievers. We appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
Columbia Southern University's completely online criminal justice degree programs are built with your busy schedule in mind. Whether you are interested in pursuing law enforcement, social services, homeland security, or a related field, a degree in criminal justice will prepare you for a career serving and protecting your community or nation. Learn more at columbiasouthern.edu/CJ.